Hi everyone, welcome back to the Scottish Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host Chris, and here we delve into the multitude of strange occurrences that happen within Scotland and beyond. You can contact us with your accounts at the Scottish Paranormal Podcast at gmail.com. You can find us on all social media channels, and you can contact us by either means. If you want to help the show grow, please like, subscribe and share wherever you pick up the content. This could be via audio or via YouTube. We'll get right into it now, and we'll welcome our next guest into the show. I'd heard yourself before talking to Tim Renner on
Sure.
Failures, and I've spoke to Tim. I've been on Tim's show before as well, just to talk about some stuff for the podcast and stuff in this area. And I'd always kind of wanted to speak to you. You know what I mean? So I thought I'd kind of reach out and see if we could get you on. You know what I mean? Just to kind of pick your brains a wee bit about some of the kind of insights you've got and things as well. But just before we start, would you like to just introduce yourself and just basically kind of about the monastic kind of life and stuff like that, just a short kind of brief intro about it, so people
Sure. Yeah. Whatever.
started.
Yeah. No problem. No problem. Do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, just go for it.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Okay. So my name is Brother Richard. I'm a Capuchin Franciscan friar. For most people, those words mean unusual things nowadays, but Franciscan we'll start with. So I follow St. Francis of Assisi. I'm part of the Franciscan order, the order of brown monks, as they were known. We wear a brown robe with a white cord as a belt, and was founded in 1209 by St. Francis of Assisi as a way of living the gospel in a kind of a more radical way. Part of the great monastic tradition within the Catholic tradition as well. Capuchin is the branch of the Franciscan order I belong to. We were a reform group around about the late 1500s that wanted to return to a more radical living of the Franciscan way of life that was balanced between meditation, contemplative prayer, and action on behalf of the poor, particularly those who were in need. And then friar just means brother. That's the title within the order. So I currently work in inner city Dublin. I'm pastor of one of the oldest parishes in Dublin here. It was originally founded for Vikings who came in and decided that they wanted to live a quieter life than they had been used to. So they were held just outside the city walls, just in case. And that was when the church was built for us there. Our own Capuchin community has been here since the early 1600s. And we've a number of kind of pastoral initiatives here. We work with the poor. We have a homeless centre that feeds around about 800, 900 people every day, free clinic, bits and pieces that are offered to people along the way. And my day job as such is teaching meditative contemplative prayer to anyone who's interested. So that's a little about me.
Well, thanks for your service to people. I mean, in that area as well. I mean, it's amazing.
No problem. Yeah.
Could you? I mean, you've recently brought out a book on still points about our mindfulness. You want to just have a short brief about that?
Sure. You're very kind to mention it. Yeah, it came about because since 2005, I've been sort of active on various forms of social media. In those days, my job was I was working with young people a lot, second level and third level schools. And so I started kind of creating reflective material based on our own contemplative Christian tradition, but also crossing over into the kind of world of mindfulness in its sort of more modern way of introducing meditation to people. Those two things came together, and on places like Facebook and Instagram and all of that, there were a number of reflections kind of put together. And so round about 2-3 years ago now, working with a publisher, we kind of gathered them, put them together. And Still Points is, if you remember the old kind of gardening almanacs years ago, where you'd have a book that most gardeners had that told you when to plant and when to weed and when to harvest and all of those kind of things. The idea is that it's an almanac of the spirit. So it moves through the 4 seasons of the year, reflects on nature, reflects on the great kind of feasts, a little bit of folklore, and also then meditative teachings for each month of the year, and also the kind of Christian calendar of feasts as well. So That came out September, 12 months ago.
And the audio version is narrated by yourself as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
which is good.
I've been told I'm very good at putting people to sleep. So that's a good cure for insomnia. The audio version is there, no problem.
Not at all. It comes with the territory and for mindfulness and meditation.
Mm,
So no, it's
yeah,
good. It's going to be next to my audio. I always check to see like the audio versions because quite a lot of time I spend a wee bit of time on the road.
yeah, yeah.
I became a total lazy reader. Since I had to actually get glasses for reading, so I'm a pure. I do still read, but mainly like
Yeah,
listening to
it's
audios and stuff like that.
I'm the same. I'm on the road a lot, so a lot of my reading now is by listening, and kind of the podcast world then takes over after that. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty much the same because I do a bit of travel in my work and stuff. So I usually kind of just I've not got any calls of that coming through, I usually just put an audio book on and kind of crack. Sometimes listen to the books a few times as well. You know, no
Yeah,
right after each other, go back through the books again and try and take it in a wee bit more and
yeah,
things like that. But that's
yeah,
good. But that's what I was checking. I was checking the book out, and I noticed the audio, so I like to double check to see if it's like. Because like sometimes quite a lot of the time when people do, as you know, the audiobooks, it's narrated by somebody else.
yeah. I
Which is
remember some years ago being given by a Buddhist friend of mine. It was the audio. In those days, it was on tape, but it was
yeah.
the audio version of the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which for some strange reason had been narrated by John Cleese. And I mean, he was doing it perfectly seriously,
Yeah.
but I just couldn't take it seriously. I had to return to the actual volume and read it instead because you had visions of Basil Fawlty dancing through your head, no matter how collected he was as he was.
That's quite funny. That is quite funny. It's good. Listen, well, thanks very much for coming on and giving us some of your time. So I was wanting to kind of like go through some things about just your thoughts and obviously maybe what you've maybe researched in the past and through obviously your studies within the church and stuff like that as well. I know obviously a quick question for you in regards to um you've got a lot of knowledge in the supernatural in regards to it comes with the territory, obviously. Um,
Yes, yeah,
but
yeah, yeah, just yeah.
but did you have another apart from what you learn with the territory? Did you have a kind of a more inclined to have interest in it yourself in regards to the supernatural and folklore and things?
Yeah, I suppose a lot of it goes back to family, as these things often do. So again, it's only in retrospect, looking back, that you realize that this was a thread that had actually been part of the kind of family story for a long time. So I think it's fair to say to a Scotsman, there is something of this in the Celtic blood. There is no doubt about that. I think there's a kind of an experience or thread, if you want to call it that. And within my family, mostly it had manifested through my mother's ancestral line. So I can go as far back as my great great grandmother, who was known. She was a bit of a healer, really. In those days, the kind of name that they would have put on her in the city of Dublin was a sharp woman. She was known as a sharp woman, and sharp meant wise, basically. So in that instance, she was called out for birth or death. Again, a poor inner city family and life. So things like doctors and hospitals and medical expenses generally didn't happen for the ordinary and everyday people. They managed things themselves. And she was one of the managers. She was a great woman of faith, great woman of prayer. But she was called out and she would pick up her bag. I'm told she had a special bag that nobody else was allowed to go near, that had all of her bits and pieces. And she would take that off and she would sit with the dying and ease them over. And she would be with the women who were giving birth. And she was known as being lucky to have in the house for either a death or a birth, that the dead died quiet and that those being born came well into the world. So there was that kind of a feeling there. What was before her, I don't know, but I imagine because it has come down, there was probably stuff before her as well. My great grandmother was an extraordinary lady who kind of put a lot of her effort into kind of breaking boundaries, I suppose. She married, she was Catholic, married a Protestant, which in those days was very, very difficult. So it was a mixed marriage, and raised children who were, some of them were raised as Catholic, some of them were raised as Protestant. Remained absolutely wonderfully loyal to her own tradition, but also to her husband's as well. And he was involved with a lot of the kind of Republican stuff that was going on at the time here, in terms of independence. And then my own grandmother was really my kind of beginning teacher in all of this. She was a woman of great kind of vision and clarity. She dreamt sharp, was the way she put it. So there was quite a number of times I'd call over to the house as a young child, and she'd be sitting by the phone, and I'd say, did somebody ring? And she'd say, no, I'm just waiting for the call. Somebody's dead. And I'd say, well, who? And she said, I don't know yet. I just know somebody's dead. And inevitably the call would come, and they would kind of call in to see her before they left very often. So she was the one who kind of taught me a lot of the old kind of customs about, dealing with that side of life. She would sit in the evenings and kind of look into the fire, and she'd see things in the fire, and she taught me to see things in the fire and all of that. So that was all just normal in my family. There was nothing, it wasn't considered a cult or anything else like that. It was just considered part and parcel of life. We the spiritual and the natural were one and the same story. You could be sitting looking into the fire one minute, and you could be, sent out the back to clean up the garden the next minute. It was all normal. My mother had all kinds of gifts and experiences and things like that. So that was a kind of a flow in the background. And then for myself, I suppose, coming into the Capuchins, the Franciscan tradition particularly, again, St. Francis didn't separate the natural from the supernatural. The one was a ladder to get to the other. His great biographer, St. Bonaventure, said of all things natural, he made a ladder by which to mount to the heavens. So in the beautiful, he saw beauty itself, the divine origin of all things. And that's what we aspire to. We aspire to try and see that, to try and live in a way that walks lightly enough upon the earth and recognizes we're part of a community of being. And so from the beginning here, I was living with brothers who lived in that way and in that world. They were very ordinary. There was nothing, your listeners shouldn't be thinking of kind of levitations and luminosity and stuff like that. It was very ordinary.
Yeah.
But there were men who lived deeply. I would say, as well as living the length of life, they lived the depth of life. And quite early on, one or two of them sort of took me under their wing and began to take me out when they would be dealing with kind of supernatural manifestations in houses and homes and things like that. And that sort of put me on this track, which eventually led me to speaking on these kind of podcasts, which I never in a million years thought I would be doing. And then I suppose alongside all of that, when I was younger, I just had a huge, voracious interest in folklore, mythology. Nowadays, I suppose what you'd call cryptozoology, all of that kind of stuff. But there was, that was kind of another element of the background music. So all of that in some way came together and has produced the person who's talking to you now. And it's only looking back now that I can see how those kind of diverse elements were sort of wound through Providence to produce this kind of experience that I'm living now. So
when you look back through time and you look through your family's lineage in regards to traditions and beliefs and things like that, do you see this day and age as well? Do you think a lot of that's lost to some degree, or does it depend in the location? Because it seems to be like there's more people were in touch with things in the past, like folklore and the supernatural, and it wasn't something like the strange or like the outcasts or whatever, like that. I mean, or or like me, people would probably, because I'm into UFOs and everything else. That mean you're just like the odd person or something like that. But it's I think do you think like these days it seems to have been that kind of lost, or as it went lost and maybe people are starting to find it again? I mean, what's your kind of thoughts on that?
I think we go through cycles of losing and finding. I think that's certainly true for humanity as a whole. Um, but I think the biggest difficulty nowadays is that life is so busy and there are so many distractions that a lot of people walk through a world that is full of meaning and numinosity and is reaching out to them constantly to communicate presence and other and being. And we just have the earphones in and the screen in front of us.
Yeah.
And so, one of the great works that I've been involved in for the last number of years is teaching young people, particularly, and sometimes very young people, some of the kind of reflective, mindful, meditative, contemplative techniques that allow us to sort of step into a more reflective way of being. And when that happens, everything begins to speak. We begin to understand that we live in a universe of meaning. It's not a silent universe out there by any means. Everything is speaking, everything is singing. And that's why, all of this conversation about UFOs, all of this conversation at the moment about non-human intelligence, and maybe there's actually non-human, wouldn't it be extraordinary? And I mean, the religions of the world, the mythologies of the world, the folklore of the world, doesn't matter what tradition you come from, they've all been screaming this from the beginning. Whether you're living with an indigenous tribe in the middle of the Amazon, or whether you're speaking to, a Catholic theologian about the angelic hierarchies, they're all speaking about non-human intelligence and the idea that we, in some way, the duty is on us to learn, to listen, and to be present, so that we can begin to take part in this and also learn kind of discernment around it. So I think in some way science has done a full circle in Europe, because you have the great sundering of faith and mysticism from science, at least officially, at least on the surface, with the kind of Enlightenment, a misnomer if ever there was one, at the end of the 1700s, late 1600s, early 1700s. And then you have, about 200 years or so where it becomes impossible to speak about the mystical, the creative, and yet all that stuff is still there. It's all going on in the background. It's all deep down. So we can talk about, the DNA helix being discovered, but it was discovered by people who were investigating, the psychoactive effects of drugs and dreams and visions. We have the idea of, Darwin discovering, the whole idea of selection, the selection of species, and that's happening at exactly the same time across the ocean to the same person. The idea of an idea that has come, or its time has arrived. We have the whole of Newtonian geometry and physics is based upon a man who was practicing the Kabbalah and ritual magic. So like all of that stuff is there, but it's removed from the narrative. And I think what needs to happen for all of us is to kind of discover that, actually, as I'm only a human being completely if both sides of these things are present. And when they're both present and they're both speaking to each other, reason and emotion, the mind and the soul, when they're all in communication with each other, then we begin to recognize that we're actually part of this matrix of meaning that is present around us, and that is all speaking to us and inviting us in. I often think of the great British humorist and writer Terry Pratchett, who died some years ago. He had this lovely piece in one of his books about the fact that in whatever worlds that orangutans exist, it's often said of them that they can speak but choose not to, for fear that they would be put to work. He said this isn't entirely true. Orangutans do speak, but they speak in orangutan, and we haven't learned to speak orangutan yet. And this is it. We have to learn. And if you look at all of the great contemplative traditions, whether it's Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, they all start with slow down, be still, be calm, breathe, and listen. So, I mean, all of the religions can agree on those steps.
Yeah.
Diversity happens afterwards, disagreement happens afterwards, that's fine. But they begin with that experience. And when we open ourselves in that way and become calm and become still, I mean, we have it in the The Old Testament, one of the most important lines in the whole of the Old Testament is a line from Psalm 46 that just says, "Be still and know. Be still and know that I am God." In other words, when we become still, we enter into a knowing that is beyond intellectual knowing, but is a knowing in the bones, as they used to say. The old ladies here used to say, "Do you know it in your blood and in your bones?" And if you knew it that way, then that was a real knowing, So I think this is what's happening for us. And all of the discussions, whether it's on your podcast or Strange Familiars or 6 Degrees or any of those, they're all following the same kind of path in many different ways, but it's the same path, which is, oh, I wonder, what does it mean if the stories are actually true? And then we begin to meet people or listen to people for whom the stories are true, where the stories have actually burst into their life. And then the next step after that is to discover that there's nothing unusual about these people. They're the same as you and me. What's happened is that in some way, either the story has burst in and they've been forced to listen, or maybe they have just slowed down enough to listen, or events have happened in their life that have allowed them to listen. But if we listen, we'll hear the same thing. Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question.
No, totally. Just one quick thing I'll add in there, which is it's for a slight tangent, but quite funny. My wife showed me a clip of there was a monkey escaped through the Highland Zoo. There's a zoo up outside Aviemore. The monkey escaped for a number of days, and it showed the newsreader on a clip with the zoologist or whatever at the thing. Once the monkey got captured again, I was thinking when you're saying the analogy of the orangutan about speaking, and he said, "Well, do you think he can escape again?" He said, "I don't think he'd like to, with the temperatures outside up in the north of Scotland." And he said, "Well, I bet he's got some stories for his friends." And the guy said, "Doesn't he speak?" No, it was funny. It was just on the news. But
there you go. Yeah. Same thing. Yeah.
Interesting enough, though, where the whole disclosure movement is going on now in America, and there's a vast array of different aspects of that. I mean, like on the surface here, for people who are just coming to the subject, and then people who are like maybe following the subject and following the whole kind of behind the scenes, what's going on, and reading between the lines what people are speaking about as well, and things that are coming out with different people. And you get things obviously they say, like, for one kind of thing, people always say if for example, if there is anything there in the land in the White House lawn and whatever else, and then it's going to cause chaos and it's going to cause religions to fold and things like that. But as you're saying there, like these things have been in the scriptures from like dot, you know what I mean? And but I find it interesting where some of the things that came out initially in the wash, when you had Lou Elizondo and he was talking about some of the higher ups that they didn't want nothing to do with the whole UFO phenomenon because they thought it was evil or thought it was like demon, Satan, you know what I mean? But I suppose you could understand that viewpoint from where they're coming from in regards to the scriptures and things like that as well.
I think there's a couple of pieces there. The first is we may be watching something in which many things are true at the same time, which is, if we're talking about disclosure, which is, it could be a moment when forces in the government want to tell us the truth as far as they know it. Great, fantastic, if that's the thing. It could also be disinformation. It could also be a fielding exercise to actually find out, well, if we can bring forward all of these people who are working on it in the margins and actually find out what they know, they might actually tell us something that we don't know. And, it could also be kind of a way of hiding or confusing or obfuscating other truths so that people are distracted in one way or another. But if we come back to that idea, the idea that there are certain people who think, okay, I'm looking at this from a particular perspective, a religious perspective, and I therefore judge it to be evil. And so I'm saying we do not approach this, or we run away from it, or whatever. The question then has to be asked, well, what's their particular perspective? What's their worldview, their understanding that their particular faith gives them? And so far as I can see, in terms of what I've read around it, they seem to be coming from what I would call a kind of a fundamentalist / evangelical Christian viewpoint. So they're coming from a very, very clear understanding for them as to everything within this little circle is good and everything outside of this circle is bad. And if there are things that appear that we don't have clear categories for, my job then is to find, do I file it in the circle or outside the circle? So there's a very clear moralizing good, bad, etc. within it. Now, the broader Christian traditions, things like, for example, the Orthodox tradition or the Catholic tradition or whatever, would have a very different way of looking at it. They would say that everything must be considered on its own merits. So, in other words, if you turn up in front of me and I don't know you from Adam, then my job is to listen deeply enough to you and to your way of being and to the way you talk and to the way you act, etc. And from that, then make a discernment as to, well, is this somebody who's bringing goodness into my life? Is this someone who's bringing, difficulty or could lead me the wrong way or whatever it might be? And then I change my behavior according to that. When we come to the UFO question, what our evangelical Christian friends are missing is that there has been around about 2,000 years of debate and conversation and questioning around everything from, are we the only ones in the universe, right the way back to the idea of, if we have an infinitude of worlds filled with an infinitude of peoples, where does that actually place us? Where does that put us? So all of those questions already have been answered, and there's a philosophical framework for all of them. As far back as I think it was around the year 1100, there was a guy called Virgilius of Salzburg. He was an Irishman who lived in Salzburg. He was a bishop, and he was the first Vatican astronomer. And he wrote a book on the idea that perhaps there was another Earth on the other side of the sun. And if there was, that was probably where the fairies and the elves lived. And they were able to travel from there to here. Now, it was a speculation. That's all it was, a speculation. But at the time, there were the fundamentalists in those days as well, who rabidly said, well, he's going outside of Scripture. He's not, he's not doing his homework properly. And so therefore we'll report him to the Inquisition, the kind of, the peer review of its time, shall we say. Yeah. And he was roundly rejected, and he was told, go away and have a think about it. And he came back and said, it's just a speculation, that's all it is. And he went on. Now, he's a canonized saint. But the idea that a lot of people are missing is that within the tradition itself, the broader tradition, there has been lots and lots and lots of conversation about it. That's not me saying they're good or they're bad. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a better place to come from to say, we don't know. And until we actually have knowledge, actual knowledge, as opposed to just experience, anecdote, etc., we can look at something and say, okay, let's take the sort of the alien abduction thing as though it is 100%, X-Files real, okay? Mm-hmm. We can say there are physical things coming into our lives or into our homes or whatever, and they are physically hurting or examining, and we don't seem to have any power to be able to change that or get rid of it. We then have the fact that if that's considered in one thing as one little element of human experience by itself, that's what that looks like. But if I'm wise enough to look beyond that, mm-hmm. I will discover that very, very similar things have been reported for thousands of years, right the way back to the beginning of recorded history, with different names and at times different look. But the folklore of 1,000 years ago actually gives me more power to deal with that situation than the science of today does. Mm-hmm. It gives me the power to integrate it into an experience of multiplicity of being. And it also gives me, it takes away the ontological shock, that great phrase that everybody is using at the moment. There is no ontological shock for the religions when it turns out that there are other things there, because they've been saying there's other things there forever.
Definitely.
The second element, though, is that folklore, and Tim Renner is always saying this, folklore remains because it works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have the folklore that, you know, it's not good to invite things into the house without knowing their intentions or what they are. There's a reason for that. It's because somebody got bitten along the way by something. You know, something went wrong. And the same is true for dealing with visitors, if we want to call them that, or whatever they might be. So what we discover then is that within the folkloric end of things, there are time-proven remedies that can stop this from happening. Now, if it worked with the things that we called, you know, the good people, or the various forms of ghosts and bogies and all of that kind of stuff 1,000 years ago, and it now works with the others, well, the logical inference is that we're dealing with something that has at least something in common. Mm-hmm. These two things must have elements in common. So I think, going back to our friends, whether it's what do they call the Condon or the Condine group or whatever it is, Collins elite, this idea of these group of people saying, run away from them, they're dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, I have no issue with saying run away from anything until you know what it is. Mm-hmm. Be clear about what it is. But I think we're only being told a very little bit of the story. Yeah. And the more the research goes on into, it's like the Newtonian thing. We get Newton's geometry, but we don't get his alchemy. Mm-hmm. So if we look at all of the kind of scientists who were involved at the very beginnings of the kind of modern disclosure pathway, going back to the 1940s, 47s, or whatever, 45, 47 end of things, and we dive down a little deeper, we discover that a lot of these guys were involved in things like ritual magic. They were involved in things like various forms of spiritualism, etc. All of that kind of stuff there. Now, as scientists looking at things, but also looking for modes that worked, mm-hmm. you have to ask the question, you know, have they connected in some way? Is there a connection with all of this? That does not mean that there are not extraterrestrials or interdimensionals that are just other beings. Doesn't mean that at all. Mm-hmm. But it means we have to be careful, I think, constantly. Mm-hmm. But with that wide understanding of what's there, rather than in a narrow, it's always going to be black, white. It's always going to be angel or demon.
Yeah.
You know,
there could be a full ecosystem there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we you know, various philosophers along the way propose what they call the infinite ladder of being, that between two beings there will always be another being that has the elements of both on either side. So we can go right the way through from, you know, the divine all the way down to inanimate matter, if such a thing actually exists, all the way down to that, and say there is an infinitude of places and points along the way, because divine creativity is infinite. So if the divine is going to be creative and fulfill its divinity, one has to assume that there is an infinite variety of being. And this would mean that between us as sort of the mixture of matter and spirit that human beings seem to be, or matter and consciousness, if you want to call it, go that way, and say the angels, who traditionally would be seen as just spirit, there is an infinite number of possibilities between those two things, and an infinite variety.
I found it interesting recently. It was a conversation on a podcast with Diana Pasulka, and it was in a book as well. It was in a recent book as well. When she was visiting Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée, he's been studying this from basically probably one of the longest UFO researchers, you know what I mean? It's out there now, and he's been working with the government on certain things as well, and whatever. So he's probably got a bit of knowledge there, maybe some things he can't talk about, but he's still in the mindset where it's, I don't know, when he talks, he still realizes he doesn't know what it is to some degree. But it was interesting that when Diana Pasulka went to visit him, and this is a man who's like computer scientist, been involved in kind of the whole kind of UFO. He's been a scientist. I mean, the whole kind of UFO thing, and he had a vast array of books on angels and fallen angels, like a lot. I mean, and that seemed to be like his interest in that. You know what I mean, as well, and the fact that as well he was a Rosicrucian, and as well as what's his name? Uh, Nothing wrong with that, but in regards to
Oh,
the just
Heineck was
Heineken,
Rosicrucian
yeah,
as well.
Heineken.
Yeah,
So
just
you can see the
fascinating.
connect.
It's
It's fascinating.
absolutely fascinating to see this. This is woven all the way through, and I think Diana Pasolka is very, very interesting as a whole voice in this, a kind of a synthesis around it.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting though is that the logical inference is usually we look at the past and we say, oh, they named them as angels and demons, but they didn't really know what they were talking about. Actually, these were interdimensionals or alien entities or whatever it might be. If you're really playing logic, though, you will have to go the opposite way
Mm-hmm.
and say, perhaps in the past they did know what these things were
Mm-hmm.
and we forgot, and we're just putting new labels on them.
Yeah.
So if I sit down and say an angel is a being that can exist in the spiritual world while having effect on the material world, that it is an entity of pure thought who can be anywhere it wants to be by simply exercising its will, and can manipulate circumstances around me, whether it's for good or ill, depending on what kind of angel it is, such that it knows my intellect, my life, my body, my mind so well, even at a glance, that it can make sure that the right set of circumstances arise around me so as to produce a particular thought or a particular emotional effect, which then my will has to consider whether it will respond to or not. Right? That's the basic classical understanding of what an angel or a demon is. The angel's obviously positive, demon negative in that sense. But then we also have, I mean, look at your country and look at my country. We have thousands of years worth of lore of other beings that aren't angelic and aren't demonic and aren't entirely spiritual, but aren't entirely physical either. And we have all kinds of titles and names for them and all kinds of categories for them as well. And so I think one of the questions that they're not asking is they're still in the 19th, 20th century model of, as time progresses, this means we are actually getting better at knowing things. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you look at history overall, there is no evidence for that at all. History is a constant remembering and crashing, remembering and crashing, remembering. So we're in a panic at the moment because the same kind of forces and politics that we saw twice in the 20th century lead the world to catastrophic war are arising again. And people are saying, how is this possible? It's possible because we haven't taken the historical view. We're not actually looking at, in a wide historical, philosophical view at what we have done before and how we remedy that. So not to get into politics, but it just shows that model, whereas if you stand back and take the wider view, and I suppose that's it's one of the reasons why monastic life exists in every one of the religious traditions. There are the men and women who go apart, who feel themselves called apart to live a more contemplative, deep life, liminal life, whatever way you want to put it. And so by actively choosing the liminal, two things happen. The first is you gain perspective, and your job then is to try and speak perspective to the polis, to the city at large, to the political entity. And the second thing is, by choosing the liminal, you become a place where the divine, the other, the spiritual, whatever you want to call it, depending on your own tradition, your own way of looking at things, the NHI, whatever you want to call it, is then able to enter and speak directly to the polis in that way. Mm-hmm. So when you look at someone like, say, Jacques Vallée, who's saying, I'm a scientist, I'm an computer, not engineer, but what would I say, entrepreneur. I'm someone who has been involved with internet from the very beginning. The whole question of what actually is the internet, where does AI come from, all of that stuff. And then you have the huge interest in NHI or alien intelligence or whatever it might be, and folklore. And I'm also a practicing Rosicrucian. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating mix.
Definitely.
Fascinating mix. But the question I would have for a lot of those people is, are you looking at what was known in the past simply as I have to take my present day model and impose it on the past and the present to speak to each other and to learn from each other. Because I think we're still in the situation where we're looking at the past and saying, simply because it's historically before, it is less than.
Yeah.
And that's it doesn't allow the insights of the past to actually breathe freely.
And
There's a great
learn from it as well. I mean, that's it. It's no learning from the past situations and past the timelines that happened. It's no.
Yeah. So when I was asked by one of the brothers to go out with him to a house to find out, what was going on because people were having, difficulties in their house. We started in a very, scientific method way, which was literally tell us what's going on, and we will try and find every possible way of finding, earthly, ordinary, physical circumstances that can produce what you're talking about. Ever before we will go to the spiritual end of things or the kind of the other end of things. And that continues to be the methodology, and it cures about 80% of what you're out with. The next 10% of stuff tends to turn out to be physical circumstances plus human trauma together. And that produces a whole load of stuff. And what you're dealing with there is somebody who needs, counseling and good listening to and the ability to kind of put their life back into some kind of order. And then the last 10% is where those two elements may be there, but there's something else as well.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes that the understanding is, oh, well, if I'm talking to the religions, they're only going to be off up in the spiritual end of things. They're not actually dealing with the practical boots on the ground. And yet 90% of what we do is boots on the ground.
You're still there?
I am, yeah. I don't know if
I thought you froze a wee minute there.
Yeah, just a moment of stillness.
No, that's it. No, you froze a wee minute and it was just kind of sort of stayed there.
Sure.
It was. I was kind of thinking, do you see correlation between if you look into delve into the UFO phenomenon and you delve into the abduction phenomena, and then like if you take the abduction phenomena for example, there's good and bad experiences on that. There's good, bad, and indifferent experiences on it. Do you look at the bad experiences in regard to, and if you look back far enough, you could correlate it to things like incubus and succubus and things like that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Could that be like a correlation in there that you could see? And on another kind of tangent for that as well, when you see this phenomena happening, why do you think it is sometimes to do with place?
Yeah.
Like a window or a certain place.
Absolutely. So we'll start with place and then talk about the other stuff. So again, looking at the spiritual traditions, there has always been the understanding that there are holy places, right? There are good places. There are places that for whatever reason people seem to experience illumination, enlightenment, encounter with the divine, whatever it might be. And these often become places of pilgrimage, places of healing. You could think of Lourdes, you could think of Mecca, you could think of, so many different places in the world where people kind of align spiritual intention, physical journey, physical activity, and maybe a spiritual event happened there that first attracted people to it.
Yeah.
So in exactly the same way, I think all of us would say there are places we've encountered in our lives where the uncanny instinct has just been raised and we've kind of said, I don't know why, I just don't like this place. There's something not working there, right? Now, does that mean it's supernatural? Not necessarily at all. It can be a way of bringing physical circumstances together. So, for example, when we're called out to see a house or a property that is, in inverted commas, haunted, one of the first questions is there water running underneath this place? It's one of the first questions. Because what we have found over the hundreds and hundreds of years of doing this is there's a huge correlation in terms of bad sleep, bad dreams, sometimes sickness, feeling of weakness, mental fog, etc., when there is water running under a place, or particularly if water did run before, but it was dammed up or culverted in some way. Okay. Now, the scientists can look at that and they can give you all kinds of reasons for it. Water makes things damp, mold is induced, we breed the mold, whatever it might be, all of those kind of things. But the fact remains that there is a huge level of folklore and geomantic practices in all of the traditions, etc., that would say water should be allowed to run free, houses shouldn't be built over it, they can be built beside it. In Donegal, up in the north here, and I'm sure in Scotland as well, there were the people who were the kind of the fairy seers or whatever. They'd be called out to see a site before a house was built to make sure you weren't building on a fairy path or a line of energy or whatever it might be. And even the way we build temples and churches and all of that kind of stuff, the consecration of space is done in a very particular way to say this is for a particular purpose. Unfortunately, most of us have lost the preparatory practices for these things. We end up just building because, it has a nice view, or, this is where I want to go, or this is where I can afford to live, as for most people nowadays. And even when people, up to 50 years ago, 20 years ago, especially in Ireland, the vast majority of people, when they moved into a house, the very first thing they did was the house was blessed. It was the very first thing, The same is true in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Judaism, etc. When the house was being set up, part of moving into a place was blessing it, invoking protection, asking angels or the various protectors in the traditions to be there. That has lapsed hugely. And so what we find is when we turn up to a place now, one of the things you have to do is kind of restore that. You have to sort of bless it and sort of mark it. Because what that blessing did was it said to the universe, this spiritual powers, consciousness, whatever way you want to call it, it said to them, this is a place that is now safe for these people. It doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to them. If there was anything here, it's now, in the power of the spiritual tradition, told to go and be gone. And the people are in a clean place or a clear place to begin with, to start. We have an old proverb here in Ireland that's in the Gaelic is Cuimhníonn an Tír which is the land remembers the monks. And it was the idea that wherever there had been a monastery for a number of years, even if the monks moved away or the monastery was destroyed, the land was still a healing place because you could go to it and you could partake of the spiritual meditative energies that had changed the place in that way. So we still go to the holy wells, still go to the holy trees, the ruins, etc., that are there. Now, what happens if we go negative? If we go negative, what we discover is that there are places, call it the window areas, or the places that get a bad name, or the liminal areas, or crossroads, and all of those kind of things, where people over time maybe experience the uncanny. And then because they experience it there, they bring practices to that place. So in exactly the same way as the pilgrimage, the holy pilgrimage place, a spiritual event has happened there. People have noticed it. They begin to go. It generates more and more presence. The same is true for the opposite. So I think when we're dealing with the UFO or the alien, if we want to take that as being other, as being part of this, why wouldn't it be attracted to that? If it's an energy, if it's a being of energy in some way, or a spiritual being, if you want to call it that, it's going to pick that up as well. And so there may be weak points or doorways or places that you can pass through. And, we've all of these stories of encountering places that 1 minute they're there and the next minute they're not. That in some way realities have interposed themselves. And the fairy tales and the myths tell us what to do in that case, which is if you're in a place that you didn't see before and it's turned up, you be very polite and you make sure you get out as quickly as you can. Like this is what you do. I had an experience of it myself many years ago in here in Dublin, where I ended up in a shop that just doesn't exist. It's not there. I went back 2 days later and it wasn't there. Having walked 3 or 4 streets, intimately to try and find the place I'd been before, I had to say, okay, it was there then, it's not there now. There's nothing I can do about that.
What was it?
It was one of these very strange gift shops. I was shopping for Christmas gifts for family, like very ordinary. No, I was not in liminal mode, if you want to put it like that. And along one of the old streets here, a little street called Drury Street, which is kind of all boutique little shops, sell all kind of bits and pieces. There's an old arcade there with various everything from antiques to tat to beautiful books to all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Walking along, came across a little shop that the strange thing about it was Christmas. It was very, very busy. There was nobody in the shop except the lady who was, when you look back, you see these strange things. But at the time, I was just looking for a gift for my sister, who at the time, she was 12, 13. And they had she was big into fairies at the time, the kind of toys and stuff like that. And the shop had some stuff of that ilk. So I went in, there was nobody there. The shop was very, very quiet. And I found something for her, kind of a little statuette thing. Went to the till, paid the lady who was there. There was no words between us other than the usual courtesies of shopping, kind of. So there was nothing of great import with this. I left, brought the object home, showed it to a friend of mine who said, "Oh, my sister would love one of those. The next time you're in town, could you pick one up for me and I'll pay you back?" I said, "Of course." 2 days later, I was in town, went to the street, said, "I'll pick this up." And the shop just wasn't there. The two shops either side were there, but that shop wasn't there. And I walked, as I say, for about half an hour. I walked every street around it, convinced I'd made an error. It was gone. And years later, I asked my sister, "Do you still have that?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, it's up on a shelf somewhere." And she went to get it and it was gone. Nobody knows what happened to it. So that's the story. It's meaningless in the sense that nothing of great import seemed to happen to it. But it's meaningful in the sense that it lets me know the mutability of place. And the fact that you have various realities that are layered on top of each other all of the time. And at times we wander from one to the other. And half the time we don't even notice we're doing it.
Especially these days, when people are on their phones.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great Far Side cartoon I often refer to, and it's one of those beautiful, it's a small boy who's holding a toy car, and he's looking up, and he's in the middle of a dark, dark forest, trees everywhere. And the motto at the bottom says, when Tom looked up, he suddenly realized he wasn't in the toy shop anymore. And that's it. That's the joke. That's the story. So you can look at that as one of two ways. Either he just walked out of the shop looking at the toys so much that he arrived in this place and he's now lost. Or you can ask the question, was he in the toy shop at all? So you've that wonderful kind of mutability of possibility that's there. But I think, coming back to your question then about the whole UFO abduction, the whole incubi, succubi, all of those kind of things along the way. I think, you arrive at a point of saying, well, does it talk like a duck? Does it walk like a duck? And if it does all of those things, well, is it a duck? And so if you have beings that seem to appear and want, it seems to me from my reading of the literature that apart from the very positive ones that seem to happen from time to time, there are three things wanted within the abduction literature all of the time. Physical material from the people they're abducting, and they take things, okay? Fear and shock, which is what they seem to want to generate. Because if these creatures are as powerful as they seem to be, or they say they are, then why don't they disguise themselves perfectly? If they have the power to make illusion, of illusion, of glamour, shall we say, as much as they seem to have, if they have that power, why do they startle and fear and make people upset and worried and all of that, And the third thing is a very unhealthy obsession with human reproduction. So those three things traditionally were always seen as belonging to the elemental, well, not the elemental, but the fairy kingdom particularly. That's what every fairy story has that. It's the idea of there's stuff humans have that we want. And by the way, the reason you put milk out for the fairies is to stop them taking blood. The whole thing was, well, give me a liquid that has life in it. That was the whole thing, because I don't have life.
Mm-hmm.
You have life. So I'll take blood if I can get it, but if I can't take blood, well, I'll take milk. And the same is true for the other, um, human fluids. And very often in folklore, you've got to read between the lines. So when people would be making offerings of milk, etc., it might have been other fluids that were being offered.
Yeah.
Just couldn't say it in the kind of in the stories, Um, the same is true for the shock and fear, and the glamour is never perfect. It's always, well, we can appear to some extent, but there'll always be a moment where you realize, or there's a moment where we have to reveal ourselves, or a moment of shock. And then the third thing is this human reproduction end of things, which is we can't reproduce the way it's very difficult. It's very hard for us to reproduce. So we have to take humans into our world to try and help us and assist us. I am not saying it's a 1-for-1, but I am comes very, very close to anybody who's reading or anybody who's looking around. Now you can, and as I say, the logic works both ways. You can say, oh, those people hundreds of years ago met aliens, they just called them fairies. But we have to be able to say, well, those people who are meeting aliens, perhaps they're actually meeting fairies, And I remember some years ago, I was living up in Donegal, the north of our country, which is very similar to the Scottish Highlands. And a lot of the folklore it's very alive up there. And I said this to Tim, I was talking to one of our groundsmen. We have a beautiful forest up there we look after, and there's no doubts, like we're just one of the guardians who look after it. There's others there that look after it as well. But one of the men who's fourth generation on that land looking after it for us, I was chatting to him one day, and he was kind of pointing out various land sort of marks that to know and to be aware of. And we have a large, what we would call a fairy castle, which is a huge fairy hill with a big rock that comes up through it. Perfectly left alone, always left alone. And I said to him, as he had brought it up, because they very seldom bring it up there, I said to him, well, what about, faith in the fairies? Do people kind of still have a lot of belief in them up there? And he just looked at me, he said, no, I said, nobody believes in that. I said, all right, fair enough. And he said, why would you believe it? Like, they're there. Like it was just like he was pointing out the cows or the deer, it was of the land. Like you believe in God, but this is a different thing entirely, and you just leave them alone. So they had an extraordinary experience there where they were creating a new path, a new road some years ago through the forest, and they kept moving rocks. And when the workers would come back the next day, the rocks were all back exactly where they had been. So it happened 3 times, and at the end of that, they just went, okay, the road isn't going through here, and they just left it grow up. Yeah. Big boulders that came back every night.
It's mad stopping it. Like I've heard the same type of stories as well, because when you go across to like Iceland and some of the Nordic countries, I mean, they've got a strong belief in folklore, and they'll not put roads in places where there's like fairy mounds or
divert around. Yeah.
The whole fear aspect of it, though, when you're talking about that in regards to the like part of the abduction phenomena. I'm not saying all of it, because there's something that is like love and light, and there's something that's quite negative. But when you look at the point where you have they're trying to induce fear, some type of fear, and that kind of, there's a kind of thinking in that, because like you're right what you say, if they're this far advanced in technologies or whatever, they should be able to mask whatever they're doing without people knowing, or at least being as scared and things like that. And it seems to be something like that, something like feeding in fear. And one kind of thing where it did kind of stick in my mind for some cases where you hear through the books and reading some stories about it, and this has happened quite a few times where this is happening, and people have prayed or asked for Jesus Christ and things like that. These things have disappeared. So have they disappeared because they don't like that, or disappeared because of the fact that they can see that they're causing some type of harm or grief, and they're leaving because of that? I mean, I find that aspect pretty interesting.
The pray the grey away, as some of the American evangelicals were talking about. I mean, I'll quote Tim Renner on this, which I think is important, is that it may not necessarily be about, so you've got to be careful about using something like this as a proof text for your own way of being.
Yeah.
So if you have somebody who says, well, I prayed to Jesus, or I prayed to Muhammad, or I prayed to Buddha, or whatever it might be, and this happened, whatever that is. I'm going to speak generally, and then I'll speak from my own tradition. So at the moment, I'm just speaking generally. Within the general understanding of that, all that we can say is something happened, I performed an action, the thing stopped. Okay? So it is logical to presume that the action is what stopped the thing. Now, the next question then, which is a much deeper question, is what was happening during the thing? Was it that I focused my attention elsewhere? Because prayer is the focusing of attention. Okay, fundamentally the focusing of attention somewhere else. And is it a case of that it was actually me focusing my attention elsewhere that switched this experience off? Especially if it's an internal experience, more than an external one. Is it a question of the deity or divinity or holy being that I turned to responded to me, and I received help at a spiritual level that cast these things away or scatter them or whatever, right? That's another possibility. Third possibility is that, and again, this is purely logic, that the other thing that was doing the abducting, let's call it the alien for want of a better word, is so determined to confuse and to deceive that knowing this was going on, whatever this produces in my consciousness or in my body, means that I won't be producing whatever it is they want to receive from me, be that fear or some kind of adrenaline or hormone or whatever I'm producing physically, biologically, neurobiologically, whatever it is. So, okay, that's not there, lads, right? The shop is closed today. We go.
Yeah.
Now, that's generally. So generally, from a logical point of view, I can't tell you which one of those things that is. All I can say is that there seems to be a consistency in the literature out there that when people have prayed or have practiced spiritually, this seems to have an effect whereby, at least in some proportion of cases, the abduction phenomena stops. Okay, that's as far as we can go scientifically, logically. Now, if I'm speaking to it from my tradition, from the Catholic tradition, I would say, well, the moment we call on the name of God, God is consciously, God is always present, omnipresent, but God respects our will to the extent that God will only act in and when we invite the divine to do so. So I'm in a moment of horror or pain or spiritual danger or whatever it might be from these things, these beings. I invoke the divine name or a holy person or whatever it might be, and there is a response, and they are scattered. From the consistency of that would lead me to presume that in some way those other beings are oppositional to what we would consider the divine, the spiritual, the higher levels, the higher realms of it. And I've seen it work. I've seen it work many, many times for people. Now, people then say to me, but what, if someone is calling on Buddha and that's happening for them, or if someone's calling on the Prophet and that happens for them, how can you as a Catholic or as a Christian say, well, what's happening for them? And it's very simple. In the Catholic understanding, any good conscience that reaches out towards the divine, whatever name they put on that, God responds in generosity and in kindness and in compassion to that, regardless of what name we put on it. Hopefully along the life path, there is the illumination, the fullness of truth. And for me, as I was only speaking for me as an individual, I have found that within the Catholic tradition, and that's fine. But what I hope for is that every human being, everywhere, at all times, is continually stretching for the fullness of truth. And I, wish everyone well on that path. The issue, though, becomes... So, Barbara, on 6 Degrees, I think you were on 6 Degrees, weren't you? 6 Degrees of... Yeah. So, Barbara had a guest on there. And if anybody hasn't listened to that, please listen to that podcast. It's an extraordinary podcast. But Barbara had a guest on, and I've mentioned this before in other places. It fascinated me. Who was going through abduction phenomena, and wasn't a person of religious faith, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
But wanted to call on, something to assist, and began to call on Elbereth from the Tolkien literature, and found that the moment they called on Elbereth, for those who don't know their Tolkien, shame on you, but for those who don't know their Tolkien, Elbereth is the sort of feminine, she's a star, the feminine, great feminine hero of the elven peoples, to put it as simply as that. So calls on Elbereth, and whenever he would call on Elbereth, the abduction stopped. So he was left then with the question of, well, what does that mean? Now, what he didn't know, as far as I'm aware, what he didn't know, I shouldn't say what he didn't know, as far as I'm aware, what he didn't know was that Tolkien was very, very consciously writing a religious work when he was writing The Lord of the Rings. And Elbereth is a direct corollary for the Blessed Virgin, for Tolkien. So in calling out Elbereth, de facto you are calling on Mary, de facto you are calling on Christ. So there is that level of, again, the divine will take whatever is offered to it in order to be able to move or to be present. Now, I haven't spoken to that individual. I'm dying to speak to that individual just to see where they are with the whole thing now. But going back to Tim Renner's point is there is something about faith, regardless of what tradition, that seems to be inimical to these entities. So that leads me to a big question, and the big question is, what is faith? And faith is, in its basic form, faith is an attentiveness, giving we would say the energy of the soul in its purest form is attention. So if I am receiving attention from you, whether it's love or hate or anything else in between, I am receiving the energy of your soul. If I'm receiving fear, if I'm causing you fear, I'm also receiving attention. I'm receiving energy, but it's a very, very high, strong energy of the soul. So all down through folklore, all down through theology, all down through spirituality, is when the evil entity appears, what it wants from you is fear. And what it's terrified of is dismissiveness, humor, anything that sort of belittles it, because that immediately diffuses the energy of fear, the energy of presence that it's looking for or it's feeding on. And the moment that happens, its power is gone, lost. So, to conclude that whole thing, what I would say is that if it works for people, wonderful. If it stops them having horrific experiences, wonderful. But engage, like, and if you're engaged, if you're receiving these experiences and you're not a person of faith or you're not a person of spirituality, and you're saying, well, what can I do? Well, take the example of that individual who found something that he could hook faith onto because it was an experience of goodness and light and beauty in his world through a story, and call out to that and see what happens. See what happens, because it's a thread. I find that the more sciencey investigators of this stuff don't really want to engage with. And if you look at the spiritual traditions all the way along, we have said the psychology of the experiencer is just as important as the event. So if I meet somebody who says to me, I've had a vision of a saint, and the saint told me to do A, B, or C. Well, the first basic thing is the individual's sane? Okay, that's fine. Are they suffering from any kind of mental illness that would produce hallucination or stuff like that? And if they're not, then, there's a level of, okay, now I need to listen. But what can often happen is the individual doesn't know that even if a spiritual entity is speaking to them, they will often speak through their psychology. This is in UFO terms, co-creation. And so if co-creation is happening and the psychology of the individual is being used, one of the things that we will find is that the essence of the spiritual experience is true and pure and good. But the way in which the experience is dressed may have to be discerned more clearly. So there's a lot to look at with all of this, and a lot of threads to be kind of pulled apart. But I think if people even just took the logical path first,
Mm-hmm.
recognize that logic flows both ways, then we begin to look at the past having an awful lot to offer to us in terms of how to deal with this in the present.
So it's an interesting part of the phenomena. It really, really is.
Mm.
That I mean, in regards to, I mean, what's your thoughts on, you have obviously people's claims, abductions and witnesses and things like that, and then sometimes it's no physical. I mean, it seems like these are no physical, or they're astral. I mean, it's almost like it's an astral type thing happening as well.
Mm.
It's just as it is real.
Yeah.
Then you could fall into the whole kind of category about astral traveling, leaving the body, and is it actually happening? Is it actually happening where you are? Is it happening somewhere else?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, these aren't new concepts
Mm-hmm.
within the traditions. I mean, speaking for my own tradition, I'm a Capuchin Franciscan. One of the most famous of our Capuchin friars was a man who was known as Padre Pio, Father Pio, who was a healer and a stigmatist. He's a saint. Died in 1967, I think it was. One of the most interesting individuals. Continually was investigated and poked and prodded at by science. Indeed, the Vatican ordered various investigations into him throughout his life. But one of the gifts he seems very definitely to have had, and I mean, I've lived with and spoken to brothers who lived with him, was the ability to kind of know things at a distance, and also to bilocate, which we would define as being in one or more places at the same time, consciously interacting with individuals. So Pio was asked under obedience. He didn't like to talk about these things, but he was put under obedience and part of the investigations to talk about the bilocation end of things. And they asked him, what was happening? He said, well, at different times it takes different forms. He said, there are times when my guardian angel takes on my appearance, and works at a distance from me to appear. And in those instances, it came as even a surprise to Pio to hear he'd been seen elsewhere or whatever. But it was it was so a spiritual being who's working with him, who takes on his appearance and affects a reality. Mm-hmm. The second level was what he called, and this is always interesting to me, a stretching of the soul. He said, I feel an elongation of the soul, whereby even though I'm here now talking to you, operating to you, at one and the same time, I am consciously aware of being elsewhere and interacting. But in those instances, he said it was very clear he knew he was being sent to do something, achieve that, do it, and bang, he was back. The third was, he said he would fall into a deep meditative state wherever he was. And it was as though as he closed down here, he woke up over there, and was perfectly physical. I mean, he interacted with people physically. He touched things, he lifted things, he did all of those kind of things when he was there. But what's interesting is those three different levels. And when we look at the take it back to the abduction end of things, or the experiencer end of things. What's often interesting is you might have an event where two or three experiences are experiencing the same event, but they see it in different ways, or they perceive it in different ways, or their reportage back afterwards is slightly different, because again, we're getting this out of body, out of consciousness experience. Or we have the whole thing of, did I leave the bed? Was I taken away through the wall the way I thought I was? Or was there actually a body on the bed all the way through? And what's always interesting to me is, if you look at the literature, all of those things seem to happen. There are the physical displacements, there are the non-physical displacements, there are the, I was brought into the famous Andreasen affair. There's a whole book on it, which is really interesting, because it goes from your basic common or garden abduction right the way through to a kind of whole cosmic psychodrama that the person is being brought through. Fascinating case. But whether she ever left her kitchen, who knows? All that they could say was that there was evidence in the grounds of the house that something had been there. They would say landed, been there, and disappeared again. So, and they also have what they call, and we see this also in the bilocation cases, what they call telescoping of time. So somebody seems to be away for 3 days, 4 days, or whatever. They come back and they discover only an hour is gone, or vice versa.
Yeah.
So what are we dealing with? I think we're dealing with things that at times operate on the physical level, at times operate on the mental level, and at times operate on the spiritual level, and seem to have an ability to move between those levels in a way that the vast majority of us, without, huge work on ourselves, would find extremely difficult to do so. And they may also have the ability to trigger releases of endogenous psychoactive chemicals within us, to work through that, or to move through that. So if all of those things are going on at once, then it's no wonder that people are then left with this horrible experience of, I had something that happened to me that was absolutely real. But I can't prove it to you. And not only that, the things that I thought would prove it to you, put a camera on me when I'm in my bed, you'll see me being taken. They have the experience, but they aren't seen, or the camera fails, or whatever it might be at the particular moment. So I think, again, we're being pulled constantly into a world of, I don't mean this in a religious sense, but a world of faith, where you have to take the experiencer at their word. And it's one of the reasons I praise podcasts like Where Did the Road Go, or Strange Familiars, or 6 Degrees, because they might have their theories about what's going on, but they will listen to the experiencer just tell their experience.
Yeah.
And not attempt to tell them what really happened, or what,
this is what you've seen. Yeah.
Because I mean, I can meet with somebody in the morning who can tell me that, in fact, I have met with somebody who told me that they had an experience with a small humanoid that they saw very, very clearly walking down the road. And they didn't say alien, it was small humanoid who then disappeared. I know that person. I know how generally solid and sane they are.
Yeah.
All I can do is hear that. Now, I can think to myself, maybe it happened internally, maybe it happened externally, maybe it happened astrally, whatever word you want to put on it. But as far as they're concerned, it happened, and it had a major effect on their life. All we can do is look at the effects, I think.
It's mad. It's one of the kind of stories I want to run by you, and my listeners have heard it before. It was one back in the day where I stayed when I was younger, and that's what I was just asking about place, because the place no far from here, there's a vast array, different sightings, everything. I mean, there's like old ancient burial mounds and things like that date back like 5,000-6,000 years and stuff, right? But I'm not saying that's the thing, but it seems to be quite a lot of things in that general location, and further on for that into the towns. They're all old mining towns. But going to what you were saying there about like somebody telling you that you know the person and you know they're telling the truth. You've never seen it for yourself, but they've seen it.
Sure. Yeah.
And it was we stayed in a house where, don't get into too much detail, but we stayed in a house where there was numerous things. It was like 3 older sisters, a bunch of kind of adolescent kids in the house. We had like my sister getting grabbed, my mum got grabbed. There was something at the door quite a lot of time trying to get in the door, like the handle going, things like that. And it wasn't just figments of imagination. I mean, my mum phoned the police a few times. My dad was a long distance lorry driver. He was away most of the week. So these kids in the house, we stayed in a normal kind of council house. It was semi-detached. There was a kind of big street of people. And we had a number of things happen in the house. It was always a house where I used to think it was like just fear. I mean, try to sleep with the light on, things like that. When I was young.
Yeah.
And my mum seen this a black thing come out the floor and disappear into the neighbour's wall. A number of other things happened throughout the years. And it culminated on my dad was a total skeptic. He would come back for like being out working and just think
Hmm.
like the odd story around again. Somebody couldn't sleep because of this, or there was somebody at the door, or there was like somebody had been grabbed or touched or whatever in the house. And it culminated in they were just about they're kind of version on splitting up kind of thing, and we're arguing, and they were like having a full blown argument, and the living room door burst open, and this black ball type thing shot round my dad's legs, and then it went over at the couch, and it was basically the story I heard. It disappeared. It disappeared behind the couch, and they couldn't find whatever it was. We used to have a black dog that was in the living room. I was in the kitchen, locked in the kitchen, and the cats were outside. So this thing, they couldn't find what it was, and it totally freaked my dad out. He all his my mum said all his words were, "It never had a head. It never had a head. Whatever this thing was." And it was interesting where that whole kind of story combination over a number of years in that house. It was just an uneasy feeling about it. And when I was doing the podcast, and there was a number of stories in the area. There was one that was literally probably half a mile, three quarters of a mile from where I stayed. It was a prominent UFO case in Scotland where there was a large black kind of triangular craft scene. There was police involved. Guy had missing time, things like that. It was back in '94, and I recorded it with him, put it out, and somebody else came with a story. And we had moved for the house, and it was my mum's old neighbour, and it was just synchronicity. I kind of went back to the gate and I
Hmm.
said, "Do you know the story? Do you know the story of the black thing?" And she said, "Yeah, I know all about it." And her retelling the story was that they had basically these things happen over the years. They were at a psychic fair type thing, and I think they invited the psychic back for another later time, like another day. They came back, and the lady straight away said that we used to have two massive rowan trees outside the house, and you'll know going back to like kind of Celtic mythology about like the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
rowan trees. I
Absolutely.
mean, rowan trees are quite small and they don't grow really, really
Yeah.
quickly. And these were I used to climb in them when I was younger. I mean, I used
Wow.
to climb up in them. I mean,
Yeah.
that was like
That's
maybe
big.
like
Yeah, 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 yeah.
these were the trunks were like that. I mean, literally, like
They were very
one
old. Yeah,
one was
yeah, yeah.
one side at the kind of the gate when you went in. There was one the other side. These walked up these steps, two of them,
Hmm.
and at the back of them there was another one right at the back garden. So there's like a triangle of trees, ribbon trees, and the lady had said that to ward off evil or something to that effect,
Hmm.
and she had they had the kind of readings and stuff like that. And there's another thing that happened as well when my sister had said that when the room that we're doing the reading in, she had a bedroom there like years before.
Hmm.
Her boyfriend was in the bedroom and he claimed that he woke up one, no, it was in a dream in fact. He relayed it as a dream. He said he woke up and it was a walk-in wardrobe and he seen this small ugly being and then it like it transformed into like a man type thing and then disappeared. But he relayed it as a dream. And but they retold that story, and the psychic said that that wasn't a dream. That was here.
Hmm.
So the psychic had told my mum basically that my dad was having an affair. Right? She said, I wouldn't normally tell you this, but I need to tell you. So she told her a lot of things about my dad. She could describe it with a T. It was all drive, all these different things. She wasn't for the same town. This was back in the day. And it was after the culmination of that they had the argument. So it was like the weekend or whenever he came back. So I had this
Okay.
argument. This thing happened, and then they said that the thing that went round his legs was on the couch and it moved on the couch to tea that fast that they couldn't discern what it was. And then it disappeared. And then they said that there was a stench for the next door room where this thing was before, and there was a grotesque man in the corner, and then he disappeared. I never heard that part of the story until kind of recently, but that was like my mum's friend kind of relaying that. My sister said she never heard that part of the story.
Okay.
But it was there's a lot to unpack there in that. We kind of moved away after that. My dad was a
Yeah.
skeptic. He totally like freaked him out. You know what I mean? But
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, you
yeah.
could pick it apart if you want in regards to like what kind of what's your thoughts on any of that kind of story?
Okay. Wow. Well, I mean, I would start with obviously it's at a remove, and I've never been there, so the it's always going to be I don't know
Hmm.
is the fundamental answer. But if you were just to take it on as the story you were being told, um, I mean, to me, it sounds more than likely that in some way the house had been built on something, whether prehistoric or older or whatever, but that was being inhabited in some way by something elemental. Um, the 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 um the gathering of a family and the underground tensions in a family can often act as triggers for these things. It's like it triggers them awake or triggers them present. So the fact that you had young people growing up, going through adolescence, etc., through there, we often see a huge uptake in psychic activity. Traditionally, people think of it as being a very girl thing, but it's both sides, absolutely both sides. Um, so yeah, so that can certainly trigger stuff along the way. I mean, you don't need to comment on this, but I mean, if there was, affairs going on or stuff like that, or disunity between the parents, even if the children are unaware of it, psychically they are aware of it. They will pick up the tension, they will pick up the difficulty, and that can begin to resentment, or fear again become generators to some of these kind of things. The three large rowan trees in a triangle really, really intrigue me, because that's almost like it could be as much to keep something in as to keep something out.
But now cut them down.
Yeah, well, this is what happens. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We moved, and I was up there seeing, like she said, across the road, and the
Mm.
funny, it was a high point of the town.
Yeah.
The actual street's called Mount Pleasant, and it was like one of the
Very good. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was one of the high points. I actually did go back and look at past maps, older maps, to see if there was anything there, but I couldn't see nothing. It was just
No, I'd say, I mean, it's Scotland, and it's Scotland like Ireland. There is no patch that doesn't have something underneath it. I mean, this is the thing. Um, but it sounds to me like something was being generated or triggered by what was going on within the family. Um, and because of that, the idea of something outside trying to get in, okay, you can go total Jungian, and you can say that the truth was outside the house trying to get in.
yeah.
Okay, you can also go supernatural and say that in some way something was being attracted to the energy within the place and was trying to make its presence felt. And it's interesting that this was happening only when your dad was away until the last big manifestation. The manifestation that he saw. Um, because again, sometimes the presence of a skeptic, we have what we call dampeners, paranormal dampeners, that there are particular people who you can bring them into a place, and I mean, it could have been going crazy 2 seconds before. Their mere presence will just shut everything down. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't believe. In fact, a lot of the guys that I know would love to see something, but it just knocks it out completely. We've one guy we actually bring with us to places where things are going really badly, because he can just knock it out. It's like a dampener switch once he walks in. But the element of the small man becoming tall in the dream, the idea of the small being that didn't have a head, it really smacks hugely of the kind of the fairy lore more than anything else. Um, we are the small who can become big, and the big who can become small, was the way they announced themselves to one fairy seer. And you never actually know the truth of us by looking at us. So it could well be a combination of those factors together, but I would wonder, like, for those trees to be as old as they were and as big as they were, because as you were saying, Mountain Rowan does not get that big except for hundreds of years. Something like,
I mean, they must have, because I can remember when I was between ages anyway, 6 up to 12, I climbed in the trees inside.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. But I mean, as you say, the rowan was for protection. I mean, that's what it was. It was one of the few trees that they couldn't use. So yeah. And often magical implements, etc., were made from rowan wood because of that. So yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably a combination of them, of those things. The psychic coming in, I'm always slightly wary of psychics coming in. There are definitely sensitive people who have extraordinary gifts in terms of telepathy and clairvoyance and all of that kind of stuff. But again, it's like what we were talking about earlier. It can be mediated through psychology. Um, and so sometimes the psychic can think what I'm getting is absolutely clear and truthful. I'm always wary of those people who make very declarative statements about individuals, particularly where there's moral judgment involved, because they may not actually be clear in terms of what's going on at all. Um, but yeah, it's a fascinating case. I'd love to put feet on the ground there at some stage and walk it and see what it feels like now. Are you aware the people who are living there now? Are there any kind of manifestations or?
I've no, I know the lady that's across the road for you, and I don't know the people. I would in the actual. I've had podcasts about it before. I've never even relayed where it was, what number it was, or anything like that, because I don't want to.
Sure, of course. Yeah, you don't want to. Yeah.
I did. I mean, I did though. I went back to
Mm.
one of my childhood friends stayed next door, in the semi-detached house. An
Mm.
interesting thing. There was quite a lot to the story, as well. And well, he stayed next door, and I'd said to him, did you see anything? Did you ever see anything when you were there? Because like you,
Yeah.
and he said no. He asked his sisters. He had like an older brother and another two sisters, whatever. And they said no, but we used to have things at their old property before they went there. They said they seen like black things standing at the bottom of the bed and things like that in their last property before they moved there. But it's an interesting place. I mean, there's the amount of different UFO, like most of the kind of main prominent UFO abduction scenarios, like where like actual prominent cases, are no far from here. I mean, you've got like Bonnybridge, the whole kind of Bonnybridge thing in Scotland is
Sure.
literally
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
like about 13
Yeah.
miles. You've got like the whole
Mm.
Bob Taylor incident, which is 5 miles from here.
Mm.
In that town, there've been a number of sightings in that town, but that story. I mean, when I started kind of looking into some of the stuff, I can remember the thing about the black thing,
Mm.
because my mum and dad and like 150% believe them, because like they're no like they're basically not going to talk bull and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Sure. Sure.
Stuff
Sure.
like
Yeah.
that, and it was
Yeah.
just interesting. I mean, with that, and then kind of finding a wee bit more about it.
It's interesting as well that I mean it just strikes me that as you were saying that the sighting nearby was a triangular craft and that the three rowan trees are put in a triangular shape. You know, there's all of that kind of window high strange.
Well, somebody stand like I talked to a guy who relayed a few stories to me, and he stays down in England now, and he used to play with my sisters and stuff like that. When he was older, I mean, a wee bit older, maybe in his late teens, he
Sure.
seen like a triangle. It was like a 3 point triangle above the actual house in the sky. And he'd seen a few other
Mm.
things in that and relayed them. There was just lights in the sky, but it was definitely a triangular formation of some type of craft. But the craft, the triangular craft that was seen with the guy's name is Andrew Swan. He had,
Mm.
and I know I talk about this story quite a lot because it intrigues me quite a lot. No far from there, it's like they're an old kind of road that runs between the back of the town, an old kind
Mm.
of farm road. And he was up looking at an electrical store and he seen this thing.
Mm.
He thought it was a light aircraft going to crash in the field. He said it was an August night. It was going to it was getting dark, but he could still see. And he thought it was something going to land or crash. And he ended up he drove into the next town and along that back road to try and find whatever this thing was.
Mm.
And he couldn't find it. And then when he drove along this bank of trees, the thing came across the top of his car, 15 foot above his car. And it sat in the field about probably 50 to 100 meters away from him, just sat hovering like 15 foot above the ground. And it was
Wow.
shaped like a Toblerone. So you
Oh
got
yeah.
a Toblerone
Yeah.
suit,
Yeah.
with
Yeah. Yeah.
point down the way, another point at the front though, and it was splayed lightly at the back, just matte black. He said it was like 40 foot long, and it was about I think
Wow.
20 foot at the back, and then about 15 foot high. And I interviewed him on the spot. He was on Strange But True back in the day and stuff about the story, but he um wasn't drinking or anything like that. It was like some kind of car racing and stuff. Came back and he'd seen the electrical storm, and that's when he seen this thing. And he ended up he had a halogen light in his car, and he shone the light on the object. And as soon as he did that, his light blew. and he
Oh,
got a friend.
I remember this story. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Jumped
yeah,
in his car wouldn't start, and he phoned the police.
yeah,
So police all turned
yeah.
up. As the police turned up, this thing
Gone, of
went
course. Yeah,
away.
yeah.
But when they'd researched it and stuff like that, and they got the
Hmm.
transcript from the police, he'd lost about an hour and a half of missing time.
Wow.
And he didn't want regressed because there was another man in 1992.
Hmm.
Him and his work colleague got abducted about 15 miles for on a back road with a craft, and they got regressed, and it ruined his life. And he didn't. He
Yeah,
basically talked to him, says, "Didn't get it done."
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, the hypnosis thing is, I mean, more and more as I listen to people talking about it, I think they're actually having another experience. You know, the hypnosis is almost rendering them into a kind of another out of body experience that may not necessarily be the experience they had at the time at all. So yeah, it can be dodgy. But anything that removes kind of will and consciousness, I wonder about, and I think people haven't talked about it a whole lot, but I mean, I'm sure you watched the whole Hellier end of things with Newkirk and all of that.
yeah,
And they did that experiment of trying to induce an alien abduction through hypnosis alone.
yeah. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And I think there's another more to it. It would be really interesting to know what experiences he had afterwards.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, because it's kind of just left there. And now I know for the sake of the narrative and editing and all of that, but um, yeah, it's an interesting one, and it always slightly bothered me in terms of the damage that could be done by sort of pushing somebody into an experience like this without necessarily
mhm,
warning them of or equipping them to be able to deal with whatever the manifestations might be afterwards. You know, many years ago, I think I've mentioned this on another podcast, but there was an individual I knew. He was an anthropology student, and he was going to Australia to do a kind of an experience, a live-in experience with one of the Aboriginal tribes there for a while, studying initiation and things like that within their particular tribal experience. And before he went, he was a very academic anthropology student who was talking all about the sort of liminality of their being and the way that they lived and their kind of worldview, etc., but from a very academic point of view. And he was saying, you know, and of course they believe in spirits and they believe in this and they believe in that. And he was telling me this, and I said, "Well, I believe in spirits and I believe in those things as well." And he was sort of saying, "Ah, yeah, but it's different. You know, it's different. You're from a kind of a Western point of view." I said, "No, I said this is exactly the same. You know." But anyway, he went off, had his experience. About 6 months after he came back, I met the guy. Totally changed,
mhm.
utterly changed. And the very first thing he said to me, we were meeting at a social occasion with other people. The very first thing he said to me when we got together was, "It's all real. It's all real." And I said to him, "What do you mean?" And he said, the whole thing we were talking about the last time, the spirits." He said, "They're real." I said, "I know they're real." I said, "We've spoken about that before." And he'd had this extraordinary experience of being out with these wonderful men. He was with them for some of their ceremonies.
Mhm.
And they just got tired of him academically asking the questions all of the time. So they said, "Okay, we'll bring you to meet one of the spirits." And they brought him out and into the outback, I suppose, and had a particular ceremony. And in the middle of the ceremony, a voice spoke to him out of the fire, um, and wanted to know who's the white guy, you know, in the middle of all of it, like was asking questions of the other elders about this. And they were saying, "Look, we've asked you to come and to speak to him because he just isn't getting it."
Mhm.
So it spoke to him and told him all about his life, and then disappeared. And they said, "Oh, it's just one of the spirits who hangs around here," but we gave him the fire to speak out of. So his whole worldview was just blown apart completely, utterly, utterly changed. But what was wonderful was they had looked after him for a few days afterwards and made sure, you know, "You're okay. It's all right." You know, gave him the ability to kind of integrate this. And now that he was back, he was sort of dealing with it in his own way. Um, but what was fascinating for me the comparison of that with the Hellier experiences, and now I don't know. Maybe there was a lot of follow-up and aftercare and all of that. I don't know. But it just seemed to me that the individual going in wasn't prepared for what they were about to experience. And so when it comes to your friend or your acquaintances and the previous ones having those experiences of abduction, or even sighting of vehicles and missing time, and I think they're very wise to just go, okay, it's missing. If it comes back, it comes back. If not, I don't necessarily know I'm going to discover what happened during that time.
That's interesting. Listen, I've kept you for quite a good bit of time, and
no problem. I'm sorry I've been so.
No, not at all. Listen, it's been great, and if you'd come on again, it'd be great. Because I had a raft of questions, and I didn't ask a lot, and I basically just kind of went
sure,
on.
I'm happy to come on again anytime. No problem. No problem. I enjoy these conversations. It's always good to talk to somebody who's kind of taking the wider view of all of these things. So yeah, it'll be good.
Totally. So listen, Brother Richard, it's been fantastic having you on, and I would definitely hope to get you back on again soon. And it's been great listening to all your kind of thoughts and obviously insights on phenomena and stuff like that. It pickles my brain, you know what I mean? So it's good to get much insight.
It's pickling mine as well, so don't worry. I mean, there's nobody here who knows. That's the thing. It always comes down to a matter of just being open, and I think following the truth, trying to follow the truth as much as we can, and keep challenging the way we reflect on things. But yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a great gift.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks again for listening, everyone. That's a wrap tonight, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and like the content if you like it, that is. And also even leave a review. It helps with the algorithms, it helps us grow, and brings more content to the show. Thanks again, and catch you all soon.